Education reform in Vermont remains in limbo as the Senate scraps weeks of work and Governor Scott insists lawmakers deliver.
If we get to a point where it's not going to move, if they wrap up and go home without an education bill, transformation bill, then I'll call them back. And we'll keep calling them back until we get something accomplished.
Plus, state leaders shine a spotlight on the cost of health care in Vermont, and disagreement over the state's housing policy continues. All that and more ahead on Vermont This Week.
From the Vermont Public Studio in Winooski, this is Vermont This Week. Made possible in part by the Lintelak Foundation and Milne Travel. Here's moderator Mitch Wertlieb.
Thanks so much for joining us on Vermont This Week. I'm Mitch Wertlieb. It's Friday, May 23rd. And joining us on the panel this week, Shaun Robinson from VTDigger, Mikaela Lefrak from Vermont Public, and joining us remotely today from the State House, Cutler from WCAX. Thank you all so much for being here. And we're going to explain why Calvin's at the State House and why there is so much going on. And a lot of this has to do with the future of education reform in Vermont. It is in a really uncertain place right now. Let's start off hearing from Darren Allen of the Vermont NEA.
What Vermonters have told lawmakers and the governor, and we're not convinced they've listened yet, is they support their local public schools. They don't like the way they're paid for. We don't think Vermonters said, close our schools, fire our teachers, and give our students less.
All right, so that's the view from the Vermont NEA right now. And Calvin, you're at the State House. Really appreciate you being there today. There's a lot going on. What's the latest update on what's happening with this education reform bill?
Yeah, thanks, Mitch. So as we are recording this, as you mentioned, there's still a lot that's happening. There's going to be an amendment that's going to be introduced later in the Vermont Senate to try to move this bill across the finish line so it can now go to conference committee where the House and the Senate will reconcile their differences to try to send something to Governor Phil Scott. Now, you mentioned in the offset that the Senate actually on Thursday pulled the bill to the floor and ended up reverting back to the language that the House passed months ago, essentially scrapping about a month's work or so of committee work and scrapping their entire bill. And it really does go to show just how, especially in the 30-member Senate, how difficult it is, given the balance of power, to try to count to or gain enough votes for a proposal that will be able to make it across the finish line here. There was a Senate Democratic Caucus meeting on Thursday night, where Senator Baruth had introduced two amendments. One of them, he said, was able to maybe move forward. Then they would do the second, more tough one today, which was on independent schools. And even for the easy amendment, they weren't able to gain majority support. So certainly there's real sticking points here dealing with independent schools and the role of them in our new education system, but also with our district lines and the foundation formula and how it will be rolled out.
So there's a lot to parse over here and a lot of work to be done. As you said, the Senate 4 weeks of work seems now to have gone for naught. But Shaun Robinson, the governor is saying we need to get something done now. He made that pretty clear at the start there. So what is the issue here? We've got the NEA saying, hey, let's hold back on this, but the governor's saying, no, I want something done now.
Yeah, I mean, to your point, legislators and the Senate in particular right now are really kind of between a rock and a hard place, right? And to what Calvin was saying before as well, we are talking at this point, even today, as we're taping, about making amendments on the floor to the biggest policy issue of the year, to the biggest issue that was on voters' mind last fall when they went to the polls and totally reshaped the political makeup in the State House. So we've heard concern from Democratic lawmakers this week in caucus meetings, like Calvin mentioned, at do they even have time to understand what's in some of these amendments? These are massive, 100+ page bills that we're talking about here and proposals.
And can I also just say, what's going on in Montpelier can often feel very distant or esoteric to the average Vermonter, but this debate over education reform is playing out on Front Porch Forum, in our email boxes. I'm on the Burlington School District email list, and the superintendent of the Burlington School District has been, emailing parents this entire past week about this bill, saying he doesn't support it, hoping they pull it back, which they did, and kind of rejigger it. And Senator Baruth, the Senate President Pro Tem, is from the Chittenden County area. So, those endorsements, those leaders in the communities really, really matter. And this trickling down in all sorts of ways.
They are watching. That's a great point, Mikaela. And, Calvin, jump in here too, because I know you mentioned some of the things that are holding this up. But if you could be a little more pointed about that, because people are probably wondering, why can't they get something done? There's redistricting, there's school size. What are some of the major sticking points?
Yeah, I think Mikaela just really hit it on the head there about the impact on schools, the impact on taxpayers. It came out, I believe it was last week in Senate Finance, that the way that they were rolling out the foundation formula, which essentially would remove, it would pay school districts a flat rate or a rate of what it is determined to educate a student, rolling out that formula by a certain date, but without knowing where the district lines are and which schools and which towns fall into which jurisdictions, that potentially could raise property taxes in the near term in some low spending towns by 20 to 30%. And when we talk about low spending towns, these are towns that are really somewhat critical maybe of their school budgets. They're a little bit more thrifty. They are generally lower income towns as well. Maybe less affluent is the way to put it. And so it came out that this could put a really huge burden on some of those towns. So that's why we're hearing calls from many to really pump the brakes and slow down here.
Quick follow-up here though, Calvin, on that point. I got to ask, because I thought this was taken care of with using that general fund money, paying down the property taxes. They were going to keep it at a 1%, level, almost level.
Yep, exactly. And that's the thing. This year it is about its level because we're using over $100 million of surplus funds that have just been pouring through our economy. But there is no guarantee that money will be there next year, especially given the federal uncertainty of potential cuts. The big, beautiful bill is moving through Congress. That's going through the Senate. We'll see where that lands. But there is a real concern about what are we going to do about property taxes next year, which gets to the governor's point saying, I will not let lawmakers leave this session without passing something that is transformational and that will really get the ball rolling on bringing down costs for Vermonters. Senator Scott Beck, I talked to him earlier today, and he said that the House's version of the foundation formula spends more per student, and he said that's something that they cannot support. So we are in the 11th hour. In fact, we are in overtime already. Just today, they penciled out another 2 weeks for them to potentially do their work. We are in overtime here, and there's still quite a few big sticking points that have to be addressed. And we didn't even talk about independent schools.
Yeah, that's going to be another issue too. And as you say, could be another 2 weeks. I'm reminded of that scene from Ferris Bueller's Day Off where his friend says he's going to keep calling me and calling me and calling me. And that's what Governor Scott's going to do, right? I mean, he's basically said, if they don't get something done, I'm going to just keep calling them back. They better not have vacation plans, right?
Yeah, and that kind of gets to the point of if we cannot come to a compromise, part of this is so tricky is because of the new balance of power, we no longer have a Democratic supermajority, and this is the thorniest issue in many, many years. And so whether it's housing, which I'm sure we'll get to, or education, we're seeing a lot of unlikely coalitions among, it's not just a red versus blue issue here anymore. And so to that point, will they be able to come up with a proposal that can win majority support and win support of the governor using multi-parties here, multi-factions, parts of the state? That still remains to be seen. But that's kind of the thinking here, the political dynamic that we really haven't seen in years. In fact, this is kind of the way things used to be in some ways before 2019, 2020.
Okay, you mentioned the massive federal bill that's passed the House. Mikaela, that is going to do quite a number on health care, frankly. I want to start off by hearing what Senator Bernie Sanders and Lisa Ventris from Vermont Healthcare 911 had to say about this.
We cannot continue to ignore this crisis. Nationally, the cost of health care per person, unbelievably, is $14,500 per person. In Vermont, it is even higher than that.
Since 2018, Health insurance premiums in Vermont have grown a gobsmacking 92% compared to the national average of 12%.
Mikaela, I know you've been digging into a lot of this. I think you spoke with Senator Sanders about this at some point. What is going on with what is the danger for Vermonters and healthcare in relating to what's going on with this federal bill?
Yeah, so that footage we just saw was from a press conference on Monday at the Burlington airport with Senator Sanders and state legislators as well and local leaders in the healthcare sector. And yeah, this budget reconciliation bill that the House just passed, it's a big deal. It would reduce federal support for Medicaid by nearly $700 billion over the course of a decade. So they estimate about 7.6 million people across the country would lose access to Medicaid. A big caveat, of course, is that this still needs to pass the Senate. But yeah, there's a lot of changes here that would affect Vermont, including a work requirement, which is the strictest work requirement that Republicans in Congress have ever put forward. So that would make it easier to lose your benefits. It would be harder to re-enroll, and it would apply to a larger set of Medicaid recipients, including older Vermonters. But I should note that those work requirements are generally actually pretty popular in nationwide polls, both with Republicans and less so with Democrats, but still there is a lot of support for those. But yeah, last week I interviewed the CEO of Community Health Centers, which is based in Burlington, but they run federally qualified health centers in Burlington or in Chittenden and Grand Isle counties. And their CEO, Jeff McKee, says, yeah, this is the thing that's keeping him up all night. And in particular, their federally qualified health centers, they serve a lot of folks who are homeless, a lot of new Americans who lean on federal dollars to be able to pay for health care. And if these health centers are not getting those funds, they're not going to be able to stay open.
The bill also has a cut of about $500 billion to Medicare, which I know affects older Vermonters too.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, there's so many changes coming. I talked to Phil Baruth, the Senate President Pro Tem, about this week as well. And like Calvin was saying, they're trying to make these plans to figure out what Vermont is going to do if these federal dollars disappear, and they're talking about topping off their reserves, and they're putting in what's sometimes called a waterfall. So if we get more revenue than was predicted, as Calvin was mentioning, that money could be added to their other reserves and could be used to cover cuts to Medicaid. But it's still a drop in the bucket, and that money is, as you said, it's being used to cover some other pretty important stuff right now. So there's a lot of demands on those reserves.
Calvin, there is a healthcare reform bill moving forward. Is that right? What can you update us about that?
Yeah, it's a great question, and this dovetails a lot with the work that's done with Act 167. There's as Mikaela talked about, there's things that we can't control, but there's things that we actively can control here in Vermont. And as we know, hospital spending is really a huge cost driver here. So there's been a number of healthcare bills. There's one dealing with the cost of outpatient pharmaceutical drugs, but another one that would deal with continuing the work of Act 167 and really move the ball forward. And it basically deals with, from what I understand, the jurisdiction of the Agency of Human Services and what power they have to compel hospitals to make changes. We know that a lot of our healthcare is delivered in a inpatient hospital setting, and these hospitals play a really critical role from an economic perspective in communities. I'm thinking like Newport, but also just from a community perspective and having peace of mind and knowing that it's there. It's a huge part. And so there's a really thorny conversation. Actually, it passed through the House earlier today about sort of what are the next steps and what is the impact on some of these hospitals. So we'll see where it goes from here. It now goes to Governor Phil Scott's desk. But certainly, this is just one more piece of the puzzle. But in terms of, the double-digit rate hikes that we're seeing for hospital budgets, for insurance premiums, this does not begin to address those. But I think there is a wide understanding when we talk about property taxes, when we talk about housing and affordability. I think this year, especially this biennium, there's really more of an understanding here in the State House that our healthcare costs are directly linked to how many people are paying into the commercial insurance pool and the need for housing. So it is tricky, but healthcare is definitely on the minds of state lawmakers.
And all wrapped up and interconnected. Shaun Robinson, one thing that has been done and completed is the state budget has been signed into law, $9 billion. And I understand that there are some things in there dealing with immigration that the governor has gotten some praise for. What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, it's interesting. Normally,
Sorry, two different bills on that. Sorry.
That's okay. Yeah. There's a lot of bills to keep track of this time of year. Yeah. Most legislative sessions, the state budget is sort of the final act of the year. They do it, at the end of the night, and the session is over right after that. But now we're in this overtime period that I think Calvin alluded to earlier, right, where we have these huge, massive policy issues still to deal with. But to your point, yes, the budget is wrapped up for the year. The governor signed off on it this week. It's about a $9 billion, slightly more budget, only slightly more in state spending than the governor initially proposed. They were pretty close in the end, the legislature and the governor. And to your point about those other bills, yes, so there's obviously been a huge focus the past few months on immigration enforcement in Vermont with the cases of the students that were heard here in court in Burlington. And the governor signed two bills this week that relate to immigration. There's one, it's S56, that would set up a committee to study if the state should create a new office. So it's a committee to study the creation of a new office, and that's an office that would support new Americans, is the term that the state uses. So that's folks who are newly arrived in the state from places all over the world, to provide them with economic support, social services, and that's obviously a community that you'll see a lot of leaders in the State House say we need to support these people to help with our workforce issues, right? To build out our tax base, things like that. So that's one bill that he signed. The other one is Senate Bill S44, and that would put some new restrictions on how local and state law enforcement can collaborate with federal immigration enforcement. So by that I mean like ICE, agencies like that folks hear a lot about. And well,
we've seen a lot of that happening recently. There have been some high-profile arrests of dairy farm workers and folks being detained. Some were sent back to Mexico. So this would be a big deal, and I understand that the governor has gotten some good marks from those folks, from migrant justice and folks who are watching these issues and saying, yes, this is something where we don't necessarily want to have Vermont officials working in tandem with ICE, and the governor is getting some praise for that.
Yeah, he got some positive words from the ACLU of Vermont this week for signing off on that, which is not something we always see. So definitely some support on that front. Yeah.
We're looking at Calvin. You had mentioned that housing is currently mired in some legislative disagreement. What is the latest on the housing policy there?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's changing again, like education, changing by the moment. As we are taping right now on Friday afternoon, the House of Representatives is voting on S-127, which is a omnibus housing bill. Has a lot of programs for like VHIP, the Housing Improvement Program, more funding for mobile homes. But the big one, the golden goose this year in terms of housing policy, is something that's known as the CHIPS program, the Community Housing Infrastructure program. And basically it uses TIF tax increment financing to build out project-based water and sewer, something that developers have long said that is a hindrance and is especially cost prohibitive for them to build out housing. And I'm not just talking like big buildings, but we're talking like neighborhoods or different swaths of town. Think about South Burlington and some of the investment that's been made there. So right now, the House is proposing and moving forward with a number of amendments. There's a lot happening there, and it does include some pieces that Governor Phil Scott at his press briefing this week really came out swinging against. These are policies like a covenant on some of the housing that's built with these funds or with the TIF districts or TIF. CHIPS, I should say, a covenant saying that somebody that lives there has to live there 365 days of the year, full-time resident. Another one, you'd have to prove that the project would not have happened were it not for this TIF or for this CHIP. And also there's other guardrails on it that for the education fund. There is, especially in the House of Representatives and the Ways and Means Committee, there's a real concern about, we are making massive changes to our education funding system as it stands with the Ed bill. If we are also taking money from, even temporarily, from the education fund, or in theory, shortchanging it is what the criticism is, there's a real concern there. So that is still being debated hotly on the House side, whereas the Senate also, they took some of the original CHIP language, put it into their own housing omnibus bill. Both of those bills, whether they get passed through the House or Senate, will have to go to conference committee and be reconciled with the other chamber. But I think, it really is a question of which bill will make it to the governor's desk first, and which one will arrive in a form that he can support. Certainly the one that what the Senate is working on is probably a little bit more acceptable to Phil Scott. But again, we'll have to see. This has been the biggest housing bill, and project-based TIF it's an idea that's been kicking around for almost a decade and has never made it across the finish line. So this is we'll see where we go from here.
In addition to that, there's also the motel housing program, which the governor is not a fan of, and that's going to have to get reconciled somehow. And I know there's still some wrangling over that. A couple of weeks left in the session, perhaps could be more. Mikaela, I know you've been speaking with folks like the governor and Senator Philip Baruth about this. What are we expecting these last couple of weeks of the session? I mean, there's a lot, obviously.
You know what my favorite part of this period of the session is?
What's that?
And I don't mean to make fun, Calvin or Shaun, but I like right when you get to the very end of the session and you dogged State House reporters start getting this acronym brain scramble thing going on with the CHIP, TIF, S127H45. It becomes its own
somehow they keep it all straight.
Language, yes. It is amazing to me. But yeah, there's so much going on right now, and it is really down to the wire. I mean, we've been trying to figure out when the end of the session is going to be. And then there's also all this stuff happening at the federal level. So it's kind of whatever gets figured out in the next couple weeks at the state level could be semi-moot after the Senate votes on this big, beautiful bill, and then they're going to come back, and it just keeps going and going.
Yeah, and I mean, it's even possible that legislators could have to come back later this year and rework the state budget, right? And we don't know yet. We don't know when that might be. It depends on Congress largely, but we could, even see a special session for that reason.
It's amazing to me, too, and to your point, Mikaela, about this, all the scrambling that's happening these last couple of weeks, so many thorny issues to deal with, and a really big one it seems is not getting dealt with, and that's preparing for future flooding. I mean, we know in the last couple of years alone, Vermont has been devastated. What's being done on that front?
Yeah, it's tough. We did a whole show about this on Vermont Edition this week. It was a really interesting conversation talking with folks at the mutual aid community level, as well as Eric Forand, who's the head of Vermont Emergency Management, trying to figure out how the state is going to prepare. Because, we're getting closer and closer to that July double anniversary date of the flooding of 2023 and 2024. The other big thing at the federal level that folks are keeping an eye on is this kind of reimagining or reforming of FEMA. I mean, just this week, the Homeland Security Secretary, Kristi Noem, testified before a Senate committee and said that there needs to be massive FEMA reform, which our own Senator Peter Welch and other state representatives have called for too, and we don't know what that's going to look like. It could be increased cost sharing for states, a policy shift towards FEMA only coordinating federal assistance when it's deemed necessary, which means they just might do it less. There's lots of changes afoot.
Well, it's really interesting, and you all can weigh on this if you want, but when we hear Kristi Noem talking about, FEMA needs reform, and Peter Welch talking about FEMA needs reform, they're talking about two very different things. Yeah, I mean, Peter Welch never liked the way that, the money was getting to the states that needed it. But what we're hearing on the federal level is states need to do all this stuff, most of it, by themselves. FEMA's not going to be going door to door anymore. They're not going to be doing the immediacy. Where does this leave Vermont when the next big flood happens? And it will happen.
That's the $1 million question. Yeah, I don't know if we can answer it.
Not forget now that, we're still in the recovery process from these recent floods. I mean, the state is still actively negotiating with FEMA over how much it's going to cost to rehabilitate parts of the Capitol complex in Montpelier. You know, these discussions are still happening and they don't have an agreement yet. And that's been, you know, almost 2 years, right, since that 2023 flooding. So this is a long process. And like you said, you know, how do we both address that and also be proactive looking forward?
All right, very quickly, happening this weekend, I'd like to talk about something that's nice that's happening. It's the Vermont City Marathon. Mikaela, you recently interviewed someone who's written a book about this, I believe?
Yeah, I'm really excited about the marathon. It's on Sunday, as it always is, on Memorial Day. Looks like there's going to be pretty good weather for it, high 50s, not supposed to rain. And yeah, I recently talked to somebody who was inspired to begin running because her mother ran the Vermont City Marathon at 50. It was her first marathon.
Wow.
And her mother since passed away, and this woman, Emily Hallman, who grew up in Lincoln, has become an ultra runner. She ran the entire length of Oregon since then in more than 20 marathons. So
oh,
she's
is that
coming
all?
back to speak.
Not that big a
I
story.
know, right? We could all do it. She's coming back to speak on Saturday before the marathon, along with another local ultra runner. So it should be really fun.
And I got to finish with you, Calvin Cutler, at the State House. I have been wondering about that picture that is behind you in the room.
Me too.
What is that? What are we looking at there?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I'm on the third floor right now in the State House. This is the Vermont State Capitol fire of 1857. I don't know if you can see it right behind me. There's the Golden Dome in the frame. You can see the Winooski River. It's somewhat of a chilling painting, but really, you know, encapsulates a really pivotal time in what led to the creation of the beautiful State House we have today.
And that is our art critic, Calvin Cutler. I really appreciate you assessing that painting for us. So we're going to have to leave it there. Thanks so much for all of you for being here today. Shaun Robinson from VTDigger, Mikaela Lefrak from Vermont Public, and joining us remotely from the State House, Calvin Cutler from WCAX. I'm Mitch Wertlieb. Thanks for watching and listening, and we'll see you next week on Vermont This Week.